Мы все знаем.
Мы все знаем.
Мы все знаем. Branko,
Yeah.
could you comment a little bit about the global trends of inequality, and maybe a few words on Russia would be also appreciated. So where do you think we are going as a planet, as in a country as well?
You know, when you ask where is the trend, I can tell you first the answer is that the global inequality is obviously extremely high. It's higher than inequality in South Africa, but the trend is down. So that seems at first a paradox. They say, well, we all worry about inequality, but you're telling us the world is getting better. And that's true. But what is happening at the same time, and I will explain why, but what is happening at the same time is that inequality in most countries in the world is increasing. Now, how can global inequality go down? But it can go down because big countries that were poor, like China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on, have become gradually richer and richer. So what in a global perspective in the world, lots of actually couple or 3 billion of very poor people, now they have moved towards the global middle class and some of them even higher. So this is a remarkable change. And when we had the discussions, whether it is in Moscow or elsewhere, the reason why this global inequality work attracts attention is because it is the undoing the effects of the first industrial revolution. Before the industrial revolution, you had levels of income between the countries which are very similar. You had China, which was about 1/2 of the GDP per capita, on per capita basis, of the Netherlands, of the UK that were more developed. What happened with the Industrial Revolution is the Western Europe just, and Japan later, pooled ahead, became rich. India and China stayed at the same level and went down. And for many of our generation, we took that as normal because we had story of the 3 worlds, you know, capitalist world, socialist world, and the third world. But that story now, we can see it now, is a temporary story. We now have the rise of Asia and the return to the relative income levels which existed before the Industrial Revolution. Okay. So this is actually the dramatic change that we witnessed.
It took some time, right?
It took some time. It took 2 centuries, you know, to do that.
No, so I'm still bringing you to Russia. And Russia is, you know, we government officials and the researchers have conflicting view about the pattern of inequality in Russia. Some claim it's declining, some are not sure. It's difficult to say. The data definitely is not obviously reliable all the time. So what is your view on, it's not necessarily my question is what's really happening now, but where do you see Russia's trend of inequality going?
Yes, so let me, for Russia, say 2 things. If I can go back to this story about the change of the world over the 2 centuries. It has a very dramatic implication for Russia that I indicated in the introduction to my book, Global Inequality, Globalne neravенstvo, which was translated here. If you think of this, we are now having the situation of the Eurasian continent where the rich parts are, as they were in the 15th century, are maritime parts. You have the rich edges of the Western Europe going from England all the way to Italy and Spain. So it's actually, this is where the wealth is, obviously Germany and so on. And then another pole of wealth is the maritime provinces of China. Geographically, it leads to the problem of Russia, is that actually Russia, with rates of growth that it currently has, is going to fall behind these 2 most dynamic maritime parts, Atlantic and the Pacific. Now, to go back more concretely to the question of Russian inequality, I will not go into numbers. We know that with the Luxembourg income study where I work, we have acquired a new income of the population survey of Russia, which includes income, of course it uses income, and shows a decline of inequality. But that's a small decline. The number of Russian inequality is not dramatic. But I think that actually the very top incomes are underestimated, which again is not specially to Russia, but because these top incomes in Russia are so big, Underestimation in Russia may be larger, so that's one thing. Secondly, the wealth concentration in Russia, as we all know, is extraordinary. And what is extraordinary is that wealth concentration was accomplished over a very short period of time, essentially in the 90s. I don't have a solution to that, but I think it is something which will, for many decades, actually burden the Russian development. And in that sense, I really have to say that I believe, and actually I worked in Russia in the 1990s, it was the way that the privatization was done that actually will burden the country for a couple of the decades.
Only decades.
It could even be longer, you know. And if, for example, China also has a concentration, but you know, they didn't build an empire that some of the Russian oligarchs did in 1 week. They built an empire over 15 years. So it took actually much longer time. And the concentration is now probably getting at the Russian levels, but I think it's probably a little bit lower.
I think it's a little lower. Well, staying on the issue of inequality, let me be a little bit a devil's advocate and to ask you why inequality is important. Is there any evidence that really inequality is that important for economic outcomes?
In the 1990s, and I don't want to expand too much, but in the 1990s, there was a lot of literature arguing all three ways. Inequality is good for growth. Let's suppose China. China grew tremendously, but inequality grew as well. Then there was literature that said that we cannot really establish any relationship. And then there was literature that said inequality is bad for growth. Now that literature really has to take a little bit longer term horizon, because when you look at, for example, you look at West European countries and the United States, they had between, let's say, 45 and 1980 tremendous decline in inequality and at the same time tremendous growth. We are talking about increases of GDP per capita by 3 times and inequality in the Gini measurement becoming half. This is, dramatic development. So there are all three possibilities. However, I think more recently, and I want to mention my paper, but there are several others, a paper that I did with Roy van de Weide, one of my co-authors, showing that actually inequality has negative impact on growth of some parts of the distribution. So that actually, and that the rationale for that is that inequality might actually prevent some people from being part of society, taking education, being part of education. That might lead to bad health, which of course itself is bad for productivity. It might lead to social instability because of, let's suppose, political developments, and then investors don't want to invest. So I think there is now a growing literature using much better data arguing that inequality is bad for growth.
Yeah, so many years you've been almost alone in a wilderness of inequality, more than 20 years. Now everybody talks about inequality. So my question is therefore, how did you feel then and how do you feel now?
Well, Shlomo, this is a great question. Actually, I love answering questions like that because it makes me feel good. Let me go back to how I feel then. Very briefly, I don't want to go through my whole life. I will have to give you an anecdote from the Carnegie Endowment, where I actually worked for 2 years. We had a very good president, and she said to me, okay, so give us the list of what you want to study in the next 2 years. So I wrote that was something about inequality, probably in those days, still world inequality, inequality in transition countries or something. And she says, no, the word inequality, you just delete it and replace with the word poverty. Because, we have in the board many rich people. And when they see the word inequality, they immediately feel you want to take something from them. When they see the word poverty, they feel good about themselves because they're helping the poor people. And then the situation changed, as you mentioned. So I feel good, obviously, now. I'm very happy.
So what's your research plans? I know you completed the books.
I finished a fairly large project, which was a book called Capitalism Alone. And that book deals with the fact that capitalism is the only socioeconomic system that we now have in the world. Whatever country you take is a capitalist country. And I define capitalism very simple. The existence of basically means of production are private, decentralization is, coordination is decentralized, and wage labor. So that's over, the draft is done, and I think it will be out in the summer.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I actually hope it will be translated in Russian, like 2 of my books have already been translated. But to be quite honest, I really believe that this is the most interesting.
Changing the gears a little, but I must ask you the following question. You and I, we travel across different countries and continents, and my feeling is that many places, most of the places, all the places, feel in trouble these days.
That's true.
And the trouble is not necessarily the economic well-being and economic indicators, but the way the people perceive the economic situation. And the question, so are you optimistic?
I'm pessimistic on 2 accounts. I'm pessimistic because I think what has happened is that with the internet and the media and all of that, we are for the first time able to see our rulers much more closely. And I don't think that the trust of rulers, whoever they are, politicians in general, has plummeted partly as the result of that. Because we now not only can see how they behave, we know much more about corruption, about what their wives do, about whom they promote and how. And that information, which in the past was very self-contained, because it was either you tell me a gossip or I tell you. And there was this saying that says that no great man, no Napoleon is a Napoleon in front of his butler or a maid. So they are actually to some extent all naked in front of us. So we really have lost part of the trust because of that in them. And I don't think it is a reversible process, because it's not going to change. And many of them, of course, have not behaved very well. And my last point on that is they have not behaved well, and I think it's important to realize, because they themselves have absorbed and had to absorb all the features of globalized capitalism. And globalized capitalism is a system that puts money at the pinnacle. So if you are a politician, it is a job in which you hope to make money, eventually. In some countries, maybe Russia, you make lots of money while you're a politician, but make even more outside. But in most countries, although they say they are less corrupt, in reality, it's a process when you make lots of money in the job, and then 1 year later, you say, okay, I'm not dealing anything with that company that that government that I was, or ministry I was, managing. But then, of course, I come back as a consultant. And there's no need to go to thousands of examples of people who have been in procurators become defenders. I know if you saw in this case in Japan, the guy who is defending the Frenchman who was in jail now, they are from Gons, is a former chief prosecutor of Japan. So this is your best lawyer. Who am I going to get a lawyer but the prosecutor? The president of the World Bank left a development institution suddenly because he's decided to go to the investment bank. So, this is so common. I mean, if you look at Blair, if you look at Clinton, if you look at Hillary Clinton, if you look at Barack Obama, this conversation probably with Barack would cost you about $1 million. So, that's how they make money.
It will be cheaper. Look for us.
Maybe $80,000.
So, thank you, Mark.
Yes,
but I still want to ask you the last question, a little unexpected one. So, in the framework of this discussion, you'll have a chance to talk with somebody else, not with me also. Whom would you like to talk with?
Well, I enjoyed our conversation a lot, but I would actually, I recently re-met here with Natalia Zuborevich, who I admire, and I've read some of her work and I've listened to her presentations, so she would be a person that actually I would love to talk to.
Okay, so thank you very much. I just must mention that it's the first full-time conversation I had with Branko, which was not on soccer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.